Thank you so much, Whitney, Nishant, and Jim for being here. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Vamsi Vedula from the marketing team at Privado, and I'm here with Nishant Bhajaria, who is a leading expert in the field of data privacy. He is the author of a book titled Data Privacy and Runbook for Engineers. Joining Nishant today is Whitney Merrill, a privacy and security leader, and is currently leading the global privacy team at Asana, and Jim Singh, Global Chief Privacy Officer at the Principal Financial Group. The topic for today's webinar is aligning privacy solutions with strategy and resources. It's a part of the series where we are titled Bridging Privacy Gaps Across Functions. We want to kickstart this webinar with a quick intro about Privado. Privado syncs privacy compliance with the software development lifecycle, from design to code to testing and deployment. With Privado, you can ensure software products meet privacy requirements without slowing the pace of product development. A couple of housekeeping items here. We are recording this presentation, and everyone who are attendees as well as folks who have registered will get a copy of it in your inbox. We encourage you to post your questions or comments in the Q&A section. Nishant, Whitney, and Jim will be addressing them during the presentation. Nishant, over to you.
Awesome. Vamsi, I just want to mention, we also have a privacy engineering community that we are building here at Privado. And the goal behind that is to create a space where people can exchange ideas. You could work for, say, Uber and DoorDash and be on that channel, Google and Facebook. So the goal is to essentially not just work for our companies, but to also add to the community body of knowledge by helping each other out with jobs, opportunities, software onboarding, etc. So Vamsi will share the link for that. It's on Slack. And we've seen people make allies, get jobs, other opportunities to the community. So please join. You could be in the community, you could be on a future panel. The goal is to grow the community and help each other out. So that's kind of the general approach here. So we typically discuss these webinars on a monthly basis and we get very good feedback. But this time we're going to do something a bit differently. On my panel with me are two friends and two allies in the industry, longtime unicorns, Jim and Whitney. And the theme is, how do you create a new modern chief privacy officer who can not just think about the legal end of the house from a first principles perspective, but can actually action them, work with engineers proactively to shape the privacy strategy rather than respond to an incident. So you need to be a certain kind of CPO. You need to be very, very legally versed, technically savvy, organizationally sophisticated, and essentially think big before something bad happens. So the goal is for the next generation of CPOs to look more like Whitney and Jim than the more traditional CPOs, because remember, we are in this age of efficiency. So with that being said, I want to open the conversation with a semi-intro. Whitney, tell us about yourself, how you got here. How did you become this combination of multiple CPO personas? Over to you.
Thanks, Nishant, for the kind intro. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. As everyone mentioned, my name's Whitney. I have always wanted to do privacy, at least in my career. I've been interested in it for basically for as long as I've been alive. I really credit my mom to having a really privacy-centric core in her value set. And so basically, during law school, I decided to focus in privacy and data security. And right after law school, towards the end, I was offered an opportunity to join something called the Cyber Corps, which was a National Science Foundation, or I guess it still exists, a National Science Foundation program that pays for you to go study computer security and privacy, and in exchange, you go work for the U.S. government. And so I joined that as one of the first lawyers in that program, and stayed into my master's in computer science with a focus in cybersecurity and privacy, a little bit of digital forensics, a little bit of user interface design, things that like I knew would come up in the context of the career I was hoping to have. And so that gave me that kind of technical piece to my career. I then went to the Federal Trade Commission, where I was there for a few years, investigating companies for bad privacy and security practices, as well as general consumer protection matters. And then I've basically spent the rest of my career in-house at various companies, working for a large video game company called Electronic Arts. You might have heard of it if you play FIFA. I was at a small fintech company, and then I've been at Asana for the last 4.5 years almost, building out a privacy program here. And while I'm going to speak to a lot of things, I'm not speaking on behalf of my company, but again, I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you, Whitney. And I'm going to jump to Jim, but I'll come back to some of the notes you dropped in a follow-up here. Jim, your story, and I know you have a story that's extremely interesting, but mainly want to understand how did you become this awesome combination of two faculties and defining the new CPO? So tell us about your story, please.
Thanks, Nishant. Good to be here with Whitney again. Thanks for the huddle here. So I came to privacy a bit in the non-traditional sense. By training, I'm an MBA and a product manager. So just after the MBA program, I was running programs for a defense contracting firm. I'd run global programs, and this was the early start of GDPR. And there was an inkling to build out a privacy program. Obviously, for me, that was a new foray. I thought I'm going to set up just the structural elements of a program, the capabilities, the aligning the intent and the capabilities and the tech stack and the processes, and then be done with it. But I sort of got smitten over time. I thought this is going to be very interesting in coming time. So that's how I got started into privacy. And then, I spent almost a decade in the aerospace and defense world, highly regulated industry. From there, I made a pivot to jump into financial services and banking. I ran global privacy for a tech bank. And then a year ago, I was brought on board for an insurance firm to globalize the program, to mature it and sort of embed privacy by design in a 150-year-old company and a culture. So it's quite an exciting journey. That's how I got started. I take the business-centric approach to privacy, which is much different than the traditional approach of the law departments. Even though I sit within law and government relations, I generally focus more on the business side of applications and privacy.
Thank you. And I remember distinctly, I got into privacy in the early 2010s by accident. And I worked with CPOs of various types, and they were not traditionally called CPOs at the time. They were like IP attorneys for the most part, or they were litigators. So the company would typically find the person most closely aligned with privacy, if you will. And that was typically IP or litigation. So what was your first, when did you first start working meaningfully on privacy? Like, what was that first experience like, Whitney, what was as much as you can share without like sharing NPI, but what was the combination of situations, the people, the problem? Could you walk us through that a little bit? Like, what was that entry point like for you?
Yeah, for me, I mean, like truly the first work I really did in privacy was through the Federal Trade Commission, like in my career. At the time, that was the only way to really do privacy in the United States. I mean, we're talking pre-GDPR, before states cared about privacy in the same way that they do now. So really, if you were looking to do privacy, you're looking to do something in healthcare, something with children's data, or generally like any sort of FTC related regulatory matter. And so when I was looking to kind of head into this type of career, I knew that was like a direction I wanted to go in. I really thought that the FTC was doing really interesting work. They've been regulating privacy for a really long time. And so my first foray was doing investigation in cases related to privacy with the Federal Trade Commission. And then going in-house, really working more in a legal capacity as an advisor to like a client as opposed to like a regulator. It was working at EA where I was dealing with child privacy issues, but also that was the point where GDPR had been passed and companies were starting to prepare for it to, be in effect. And so there was kind of that everyone waiting for May 25, 2018 and spending some time preparing for that. And so that was like a really, really big push. And to me, the two felt very different but complementary. And now I think about doing and practicing both like FTC related privacy as well as like the GDPR-esque type privacy, and they just kind of blend together, which is great. But they felt very distinct to me at the time.
And that's fantastic, Whitney. So can you, just to push on this a little bit more, how did people typically perceive you? What happens is when engineers and attorneys meet early on, it's typically people sometimes talking past each other. The vocabulary is different. So you came into these conversations very, very well prepared, obviously from a background perspective. But what was that initial, like, was it a little bumpy initially? Like, how much time did it take you to sort of say, okay, we're working together very, very well now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, especially when I went in-house and I started working with engineers, I really tried to ground how I was communicating with technical folks, with engineers. So I supported, when I was at EA, all of our central systems and our backend systems, which some people would say, oh, I'd rather support a game, right? I did also support games, but I really enjoyed the technical back end because I had that technical background. So system design, data flows, where data sit and data classification were all really interesting things to me and were things I had inherited when I came into that role. And so I really, when I started having conversations with folks, I started digging into the details. How is this done? Where is the data going? And starting having technical conversations about like true privacy engineering solutions in order to kind of push what we needed to push forward from just a compliance perspective, but also best practices. And so at first, people are always a little reluctant to do something, and if they don't feel like they need to, but when you kind of build out the value and think about how privacy engineering and structuring data systems and data structures from a privacy at first mindset, it actually saves them a lot of time and energy later on. And once you kind of get into that conversation with folks and bring them along on that path, they are much more welcoming and open to having that conversation. And so I was really happy with like kind of the conversations and the way that we were able to build things at basically all the companies I've been at.
Yeah. And it must have been such a pleasant surprise for the engineers to see somebody like you who can like get on the whiteboard, look at the data flow diagram, look at a tech spec. I think that must have been like pretty amazing for them. Like, because typically people don't expect the attorneys to have that desire or background.
I hope so. I mean, I don't, I hope that they feel that way. I do love a good whiteboard. I'm notorious for whiteboarding and like drawing
Yeah.
things out, especially to get out concepts in my mind and to explain complex systems and diagrams. And this is something I also tell lawyers all the time when they're thinking, how do I be more technical? How do I understand? Should I learn to code? And I'm like, I don't really code much anymore. But for me, system architecture, network architecture, being able to read and understand and draw those diagrams is going to have a much longer lasting impact. Understanding why certain types of systems exist and why they need to process data is going to go a really long way in helping you be able to advise more thoughtfully and more technically in a way that is both going to be good for the business, good for the engineers, and good for achieving the goals that you're hoping to achieve.
And that's such a fantastic point. So I remember during my time at Nike, more than a decade ago at this point, one of my favorite legal partners she was very, very comfortable with whiteboards, and she knew how the system worked. She understood why the choices were, sort of why MongoDB versus NoSQL, right? So she was able to understand that. And what that enabled her to do is make decisions in a way that responded to the engineering needs, because the engineers sometimes have to answer a bunch of questions at the front end because before they can proceed. So her ability to understand the details meant that she was able to have those conversations with them, and she felt reasonably comfortable that what they had walked away with was a shared understanding, so that they didn't have to keep getting back again and again and again to sort of clean things up after the fact. So I think this is not just good from an effective work perspective, but from a career perspective as well. I'm seeing a lot of CPOs struggle a little bit in the industry, which is why we set up this forum this morning. But they struggle because they don't exactly know how to get work done within the company. They know the law, they know the culture, but they struggle to get the work through. So fantastic point. Jim, your debut. So what were those initial conversations like? How did you get the entry into those engineering conversations? How did you make informed contributions to do this and not that? Like, what was that like, those interactions?
Yeah, so in the aerospace and defense world, it was obviously, we had a closed ecosystem for the most part, but we did do a lot of data collection. So one of the early snippets was, there's these air shows that happen, and there's one in Dubai, Singapore, States, and elsewhere, where all the key aerospace players come in. And it was just a standard practice that you want to get to know your customer, so to speak, and they would ask them, what's your dietary preference? And from the dietary preference, it was sort of like you could then start drawing inferences. Like if somebody's ordering a particular type of meal, they might be inclined to a certain type of religion, and then a persuade. So there's a lot of intelligence sort of being gathered, from just small snippets of data. And then if you translate that to, if you're developing, surveillance systems and something in that capacity, like, cameras in the public sphere, that's sort of what was triggered and sort of kept me enamored around privacy, is that things that we'd been doing a bit, in a nondescript way, but there was a massive information that was coming out of it in terms of inferences, in terms of learning about a particular behavior, and so on and so forth. So that was what attracted me and kept me there. Adding to Whitney's point, I think one of the challenges, or at least the earlier revelation for me, was, get about 8 or 9,000 odd engineers, 400 plus product teams. So obviously we couldn't deploy product councils across that span. So the problem was, how do we come up with privacy solutions in terms of speed and scale at the same time? You could have a really good product council, but they are embedded within maybe 4 or 5 product teams. That was about the capacity. But how do we satisfy that need across the entire ecosystem, sort of in silos or closed domains, and so on and so forth? So that was sort of the early onset of how do we operationalize privacy. I think the lawyers did a fantastic job in interpretation of the law and being able to translate that into the current context of a firm's operating rhythm, operating context. But the challenge was still, how do we go to that last mile of implementing, embedding, cultivating, and immersing privacy across the value chain? How do we embed it into the operating value streams, and so on and so forth? So that was sort of the challenge at hand. And it became evident that obviously it wasn't conversations, but we also had to amplify some of and we've gone through this journey, where we spent quite a few years in spreadsheets, and then we moved to templates, and now I think we are in the early days of the renaissance of privacy, where we have auto discovery and auto risk assessments, and so on and so forth. So I think we're approaching that territory, but that was sort of my journey was primarily around taking the interpretations from the law department, but then how do I go across 25 different product teams? How do I go across 4,000 engineers, making sure that they understand it consistently? How do we make sure that the practices, the protocols, the guardrails are in play? How do we make sure that we can distill the noise and still focus on the high risk value targets for us? Because the challenge was, you can't go through 5,000 PIAs. So the problem was, out of those 5,000, which 50 were the ones which were high value targets for us to interrogate and bring back to the lawyers. So that was sort of the dilemma, or what attracted me to stay in privacy.
That's great. And what I typically do in these forums is I involve the audience early on. So we have seen some questions come in. So Ryan Tenorio has a question. In general, I'm going to summarize. He's looking for resources and training. So a lot of CPOs, and for that matter, privacy engineers also learn from the ground up when something really bad happens. But how do you prepare going in? How do you, outside this halls of universities, how should you consider making time to study law more frequently? So I obviously can't speak to that. I'm not an attorney, but Whitney, maybe this is a good question for you. Want to take a stab at this?
Yeah, happy to answer that. I think privacy is changing, where it's originally come out of the need of the legal field. And so you see a lot of privacy teams solidified in legal organizations. I don't think it's always going to be like that. I think it will continue to be like that in many organizations, but I think it's going to differ. So I think from a question perspective, like, what should you do and do you need formal training? I don't think you need to be a lawyer, but I think you're going to have to shift the minds of like entrenched organizations that want privacy to live in a legal organization. So there is that piece on the leadership opportunities. So I think if you did a legal degree, you could potentially see like a wider range of options, because you can go towards the legal or the non-legal side of privacy as a leader in the long run. But ultimately, I don't think you need to do it. I think you can be a really great and effective privacy leader without a legal degree, in thinking through resources of how to learn about those things. There are all sorts of resources out there. The obvious ones being the CIPP certifications that are related to the United States, the EU, Canada. They're going to give you an overview of the law. I think the better you understand the law and the motivations behind the law as it relates to privacy, I think the stronger leader you're going to be, because you need to be able to communicate those compliance needs to leaders. But again, I don't think you need to be a lawyer to be a strong and effective privacy leader.
And thank goodness, Whitney, for making the point, because I think sometimes a lot of these job opportunities get shut out because people have all these criteria. Like, I've seen entry-level jobs recently asking for 5 years of experience. I'm like, there's a bit of a contradiction here in place, right? So on the legal side, one thing that I've seen CPOs do very effectively is work with engineers with code scanning, data scanning solutions to see, okay, what is actually happening behind the scenes? And then they can make that law aspect come alive a lot more. And I've seen people make that leap, not just with the JDs, but also people with more experience on the paralegal side, or people who were working for e-discovery. So a lot of those folks have also made an impact. The general message for the audience here is to understand that you do not always need to have a law degree to make that contribution, just as you don't need to have a CS degree to write code. Like, the door is widening and we need to expand the community. Like, we're not going to get anywhere by just having the same 10 people talk about first principles and the same 10 people talking about code as well. So Jim, your insights on how do you manage to be a modern, effective CPO without necessarily having the legal pedigree that some people have?
Yeah, I think there was a study, maybe Xterra, one of the vendors had done it like 2 years ago, and they discovered that the trend line was, from 60% of lawyers running privacy offices, that had come down to maybe 40%, and the non-traditional was about 30%. So there's still a massive tilt. I think the key is understanding the strengths that a lawyer brings to the table, the interpretation of the law, the understanding the implications, what are the case studies that are happening, man? What is, to Whitney's point, what's the intent, what's the motivation, what would a regulator be looking for in terms of practical elements? So I think those are powerful elements that a lawyer can bring to the table. But the non-traditional or the non-lawyer could bring, some approaches around the technical enablement, the operationalization. How do I embed, cultivate, and sort of succeed in pushing the privacy dialogue across and then, what I call, moving to a dashboard management. It's not like you have to hear about every privacy event or happening within your firm, because you'll never get through your day in that instance. But how do you sort of build what I call state of compliance dashboard, so that as a leader, you're reacting and opining and reflecting on, again, the high value areas versus the non-routine, or what I call the routine noise. So I think that's one. So understanding what the core strengths each capability brings. The lawyers bring certain capabilities, contract negotiations. I've participated in those, but I always defer to my tech counsel. I said, you're talking with another lawyer, it's easier for them to go out and figure out the redlining and coming back with a finished product. I can certainly opine on it, but that's not my forte. So I think it's understanding where your skill sets are, and then delegating and using the sort of the core capability that the lawyers bring to the table.
That's great. So, and for the audience, please keep the questions coming in, because this forum is more helpful if the audience participates, because I have enough stuff prepared. But if we can help people more directly by addressing their questions in the moment, that's a win for us. And with that being said, there are 2 questions waiting, anonymous. Understanding the data and how it's managed is also critically important besides just the legal matters. Very successful CPOs with a decade of HC tech experience and not an attorney. So, Jim, you want to go first here? I don't necessarily see here.
Yes, I think I might be a bit prejudiced, but the future, again, the way we've been organizing and orchestrating privacy, I think 5 years henceforth, it'll be rapidly different. So I think we have to get smart about that. That's one. Second is the tradition, and we see this if you go to the IPP summits. Earlier on, there was 70% representation by the top tier law firms. Now that's a minuscule amount. It's mostly, if you look at the vendor list and the trade shows, it's technology companies. So the problem is really about data. Data is pervasive, it's ever present, it's growing exponentially. So the solutions that we come up with have to rise to that challenge. I think now is sort of, I call it the golden age of privacy, where we're entering, is we now really have the capabilities and the technology to really get us to that point. If you think about the future state, like identity aware systems and auto discovery, and having these dashboards where from a reactive you become a strategic program in a rapid order, you can sort of jump through, like from 3G to 6G. You can do that rapidly. You don't have to wait each generation to make those improvements. But coming back to the point, I think it's really important to have what I say, you want to succeed not only in the tactical elements, which is, a particular team comes to you with a privacy problem, you opine, you deliberate, you come up with a solution set, but you really have to solve not only for the tactical, but you also have to solve for the strategic. And quite a few firms, they solve on the transactional part of privacy, but they fail on the strategic. So, I've talked to some of my counterparts where they've invested, 3 or 4 years in privacy, but they really couldn't shift the lever in terms of the program maturity over that time. They might have done hundreds of thousands of PIs and DSORs and so on and so forth, but the maturity of the measurement of that program itself really didn't move that much. So the problem is, how do you take the entire ecosystem, from a capability stack, from a tech stack, from a process side, from a procedure side and then lift the entire program so that it's adding value. It's not really a compliance function. It really is unlocking the value of data. One example I'd share, at least in the financial sphere, when I came aboard, one of the questions was, I said, it's a given that as a CPO, you want to de-risk the business, you want to keep them out of trouble, you want to be compliant. That's a given. But the point is, what are you going to do beyond that? And there's like $2 trillion worth of unlocked value of data sitting within each repository within financial firms. So the idea is not really looking outward all the time, but really taking a step back, interrogating our data sets effectively, interrogating the data sets to realize some of the untapped value. So it's really thinking about data more in terms of monetization in an ethical manner, but also making sure that all the levers of an organization are acting and functioning as one. One example I'll always come back to is the data office will tell you everything about the what of the data in terms of the classification, categorization, but privacy can then the lens around the why of the data. And once you marry the what and the why, that's the powerful storytelling that needs to happen.
I love that transition. The what and the why gets you to the how, because I think sometimes too many engineers are eager to jump onto the how, and sometimes effort and impact are conflated. And I think the CPO can play the role of helping engineering. Like, think about it, like 10 years ago, the CPO was seen as a blocker. And in this conversation, in like 27 minutes, we've talked about how the CPO can get to the why and the how. So that's such a big win. Whitney, thoughts about sort of how you frame that conversation about the data processing? The question?
Yeah, I mean, I love this comment because that's 100% true. I think when people talk about privacy, they often think of it as just like the practice of privacy as a legal field and not privacy as like a larger, like privacy, legal advice and privacy legal is like one component of a larger global privacy program. And I think how we talk about it and like especially recognize that like that bias that sometimes happens when people say privacy, they think legal, is really important because there are so many people who are not in legal who are essential to building privacy. And I've said this before in the past, which is I don't believe that the future of privacy is going to be in a legal org, like in the long run. Like I just don't, because it is only one component. And the reason I feel that way is data governance and data management is the foundation of privacy. If you're not doing that, if you're not building that out, if you're not giving that clarity to the business or just to any organization that you're working with, you cannot build a successful privacy program. You can't even build a successful security program at this point. So like, I just think like that essential nature of understanding where that data is and what the data flows are is both good for, if your business wants to monetize the data to Jim's point or secure the data or get rid of the data or decide to, do something different with the data. I think it just gives such clarity to the business to set that out so that you can build a successful privacy program on top of it. So I 100% agree with that comment. And lawyers sometimes generally, and I don't want to generalize all lawyers for those on the call, but like lawyers don't think about the technical governance data flows generally, like when they come in and look at a problem, right? They're looking at things from a legal lens. And so it's a very different lens that you have to put on it. So either you have to train your brain to get there, or you need to find a leader who you can work with, who thinks that way, because it's essential to a successful global privacy program.
And that leads me directly to the second question. I'm not sure it's the same person. It says anonymous attendee. The general gist seems to be the impetus is about automation first and then build a process. And I've seen the other way around as well, which is I've seen people get so comfortable with the process that automation is almost delayed for too long. So how do the two of you think about sort of, you have a legal position, you have identified a risk. How do you shape the conversation correctly to accommodate both a process where required and tooling where required? So how do you get that? Whitney, you first.
Yeah, so I'm kind of curious where you're saying automate first, because I kind of would be really interested to see how that plays out. But most of the places that I've worked or advised, they're building out that manual process first, and then the conversations are when is it time to put resources to automate. And generally, I think about answering that question with scalability and efficiency. Every privacy process, let's use like data subject rights as an example, starts with a very basic manual understanding of the systems and pulling the data. And that just simply does not scale. It's very labor intensive and really expensive. And so automating that is really, really important. I think also that automate versus like build the business process probably varies about where we are in privacy and when where your organization is from a maturity process. Because at this point, in this day and age, if you're a new company, I would generally just say you should be automating your data subject rights processes as soon as possible. If you start with manual, you're going to be exhausted really quick. It's just not going to scale because we've learned so much since we've started doing these, starting in 2018. But there are other probably newer processes that you're building out internally related to privacy where you might want to work through those manual processes to figure out the kinks before you're automating. And maybe that's to the anonymous attendee who made the comment, they're seeing if you're automating first, you're probably going to figure out like the issues real quickly, but like in a much more impactful way because you've automated first without kind of thinking through or building out that business process to understand how it might work or how it might affect your organization. And so, yeah, that's my general thoughts.
Jim, thoughts about that?
I think process is king for the most part because if you've got the underlying, the what I call focus and flow in an organization, that's really important where the organization focuses and how the value flows across different departments. So I think that's important. You solve for those two areas. But yeah, the paradigm should be, to Whitney's point, automate where you can and streamline the rest. So now we have the tooling, we have the products there which can help us. Obviously you have to be judicious around investments and so on and so forth. But I think this is the time where, as long as the process is reasonably sound and it's scalable, it's sustainable, you've tested it out, you've done some hypothesis testing around it, I think the paradigm should be, it's routine work, it's what I call the non-high value work, automated. I think the machines do it, they're ever present, ever listening, they're precise, you fine tune them, and you let the humans focus on the high value work, and that should be the paradigm.
And I think this question and the last one, there's sort of a welcome assumption that engineering and the legal teams work together, because you cannot have that level of collaboration. Without that collaboration, you cannot have this level of impact, which brings me sort of to a ticklish question here, like, where should privacy engineering report into is kind of one of those hot topics. Like, I've reported into the chief privacy officer before, the chief security officer, the VP of product, and the VP of engineering. So I've essentially in my career seen every combination possible, but every company is different. But I've seen this get fairly polarized. Like, some people say that there is no reason why a legal person should have engineers reporting into them. But others have said that if you report into anybody but legal, the business is going to co-opt you and the legal team can offer you that protection. So it's not an either or proposition. It's pretty nuanced. I'm sure we could do a webinar just on that topic alone. But Jim, first, where do you think, or how do you think about where privacy engineering should report into, or even people who work on engineering work projects that deal with privacy, like where should they live in the organization? Jim, first.
So again, this is just my personal opinion. So with that disclaimer, I think to go fast and and furious in around this, you really have to be tied close to the privacy office. I think that's the fastest way to grow. You could be in the, you could be reporting to VP product or engineering, I think. But the problem is they understand the technology side of it, but not the privacy implications. So, it's like, at least in my journey across different functions, I've always said, we have this capability within InfoSec, why don't we just do the scanning for you? I said, it's not a question of the running the scan, it's really interpretation of the scans. So it's like an MRI, you really, anybody can go into any shop and get a diagnostic done. It's really, you need that radiologist in to interpret the results effectively, clearly, and then make some determinations post that. I tend to believe to go rapidly, to have that tight, rapid response and being able to articulate and move it forward. I think engineering really should be reporting to the CPO. Obviously, that's always a bit of a challenge. I would be less worried about the CPO as a lawyer versus a non-lawyer. I think being a CPO, you have to be, like Whitney had mentioned, you're sort of, it's a complex organism. Legal is one part of it, but operationalization, understanding the technology and the data side of it is equally important. So I think irrespective of whether your CPO is a lawyer or non-lawyer, but I think the engineering side should report to the privacy CPO, because that is where the innovation happens fastest. You don't have to convince another 13 or 40 stakeholders around the value and why should we do it, and going through those use cases and proof of concepts.
Whitney, your thoughts? Like, would you like to have attorneys, engineers reporting to you? Whitney, tell me.
Oh, I mean, in a dream world, yes. But so I like to think about governance structures a lot. And I think there are people-based governance structures, meaning who the person is can dictate a successful structure in an organization. And I will say that like generically. And then there are like structure-based organizations where like just by the nature of the type of role or by like the nature of the company, the structure has to exist a certain way and will be successful. There are lots of ways you can think about it. I think privacy can work in either direction, where you can like where privacy sits, I think is going to change over time. I don't think it's always going to be in the same place. And I think privacy engineering can be the same way. I think it's going to drastically depend on the organization for where it's truly going to be successful and how it's set up. That being said, I think if you have a leader that can really enable and partner with engineering as a CPO, having that roll up into your organization can be really, really powerful and really, really essential. But again, I think you have to have the right leader who understands what that means to have an engineer on your team, and how you can enable them across the organization, fight for them as a resource, but also like enable them across the organization. Because ultimately, in a privacy engineering structure, there's always going to be, and you know, the future of the CPO, to my point before, that CPO could be a non-lawyer, right? And so is thinking through, where do those dotted lines? Is it you, the person sits under you and they have a dotted line to engineering because you really need them embedded in that organization where they're going to engineering related all hands. They have kind of a team and a structure that they can go and partner with. Maybe organizations are really large and they're much more siloed. So I think it really depends on the company. But I think from a resourcing perspective, if you have the right CPO leader, my general perspective is it would be fantastic to sit under directly a central privacy organization, wherever that central privacy organization may sit.
And a quick follow-up to that. So I'm seeing a lot of companies to cut costs, merge privacy, ethics, security, governance into like one organization and try to create engineering and PGM teams that can work for projects that have multiple avenues to it. I can see the efficiency financial win there. I really can. And from an ethics principle governance team will have overlap with the privacy engineering teams as well. But what do you think about my worry if this continues is we're going to be right back to where we were a decade ago, where privacy was everybody's job and therefore nobody's job. So I'm kind of in two minds. Thoughts about that, Whitney? Like, what does all this consolidation and efficiency create for us?
I mean, I think privacy taking on more than just privacy is happening. And I don't think it means that privacy is not going to be the most important thing. I think it's going to shift based on that regulatory component, right? How top of mind is it for the business at that given time? But I will say, if you're thinking about data governance as a key component, right, of the foundation of these things, whether you take on AI governance, cybersecurity, legal issues, AI, et cetera, you still have that foundation in which you're building kind of that program that's like moving things forward, even from a privacy perspective. So I do think broadening the depth of an organization can be really powerful as opposed to just focusing on privacy, because you're looking at the general governance of data. And that's what I ultimately think it's all going to be about in the long run, to build trust with your users, with your customers, whoever it might be. And so I don't think there's really, a huge negative, but I think, yeah, you could potentially put privacy by the wayside. I think I would be curious or concerned if you had a privacy leader who was not a privacy expert, who had all of these things. So like they have privacy as one of the many things they do, but really they're coming from like a completely different type of background where they're not really thinking about that data governance, data structure. I'd still want that to be kind of the core piece of the organization for it to be successful, so it doesn't get dropped to your concerns, Nishant.
So I get a lot of things from people about getting merged and layered. So for those of you that are concerned, Whitney's answer provides a way forward. Jim, your thoughts about this topic? What do you make of this efficiency and merging that's happening across the industry right now?
I think it's early days. I think the efficiency is easy to calculate on paper. Like if you get 10 FTEs and you can shrink it down to 7, that's easily apparent that, yeah, you've reduced some cost there. I think that the harder question to answer is the value still being delivered effectively? And are you able to interrogate and get the synthesis out of that consolidation, or so I think it's still early days. I think this is where we're seeing this now with the AI governance, what I call the skirmishes. I think they might turn into battles and eventually it'll settle somewhere in the future. But I think the models, the frameworks for governance are most important within an organization, irrespective of how you do it. Certain firms are, to Whitney's point, irrespective of where you're reporting, they align, they mobilize, they work effectively together. They don't need sort of lines or heads reporting to one another. In other cases, you can have co-jointed folks and still they're sort of miles apart, even though they're working in the next room. So I think it really comes back to that firm's culture. It's still early days. I tend to, again, this is just my personal opinion, I think in the future world, the data is going to be sort of what I call everybody's business, but the interpretation, the interrogation, the articulation, what value you're deriving out of data will become a highly specialized science. And I think privacy will play a major important role. We're starting to see that now in the AI world. Is it really the enterprise data office that's going to run that, or is there a specialized AI division that should be formulated to stand up and run it? So yeah, I think it's still early days, but I tend to lean that as long as you're getting value out of however you're organized and structured, that's the key determinant.
And we're getting close to the end here. So I want to look at one more question and then kind of merge my own with it. So what do you think works better, a top-down governance structure or a decentralized structure? I'm sure that has multiple shades to it. So as we think about this question, Jim, let's also think about how do you work with the engineering and PM teams to define the governance structure? How do you go for planning? How do you measure metrics? And how do you take all that to the C-suite to give them sort of an accurate temperature as to how well the company is doing and what risks exist from a privacy perspective? So how do you build the governance structure and how do you collaborate for it? How do you socialize it? So Jim, thoughts about that?
So I can, the non-traditional view I've always taken is, let's understand how we are organized and, how we sort of flowing value across the organization. You can, that's quite an easy exercise, and it brings about few things to reflect. One is, what are the roadblocks? What are the, the bottlenecks, and so on and so forth. So those you can organize and you can adjust the process around it. Coming back to the engineering team and the collaboration there, it really is, it's not, you're not solving for privacy, you're really solving for business problems. You just happen to have one snippet of it. Compliance might have another one. There could be other areas, but it really is, how do you arrive as a joint unit to solve for the business, in terms of, their go-to-market or whatever their problems they're looking to solve. So the bottom line is, you have to be able to craft a solution around scalability and being able to deliver value at the speed of business. I think most of the firms, they'll do one better than the other. Or the idea is, how do you harmonize the two? So, figure out the bottlenecks, come up with a process, make sure that privacy is embedded, but where you're not sort of, either a, stance of lost stance, or, you're becoming you have to really figure out what business you're in, and then making sure that privacy is aligned to that intent and capability. If you're simply a compliance function, then recognize that and build around it. You'll make sure that you do A, B, and C, and then that's about it. If you're really becoming a business enabler, recognize that and build around that. Then you have to really have the construct of being able to interrogate data, understand the data quality, the hygiene, and all the aspects around data. If you're going to become an innovator for the business, then you have to build around that. So it's really important for a CPA to recognize the role privacy is playing for that organization and building around that. That's step one. The two is organizing, again, what I call the flow and the focus within the organization. The third is, I think that the dialogue for a CPO needs to evolve. In the past, we've heard, if you do, thou shalt do this, and there's an X fine you have to reckon. I think those conversations are done where that's, it's sort of, bad, sort of left a bad taste in the mouth. I think now the conversation really is about enablement and betterment. And, I think there's adequate data where it's, the conversation now is no longer around, I think there's easily provable. Every dollar you invest in privacy, you get $2.9 in return. If there's adequate data around how much you should be investing in terms of privacy around, tranches of 10,000 employees, how much should the privacy spend be in comparison to ISR and IT. So I think those conversations have evolved, and it's really important for the CPO to also evolve the conversation around how are we serving the business, and we are there to support it, not strictly from a compliance, but beyond compliance, continuous compliance, governance at scale, globalization and delivery at scale.
It's great. And Whitney, before I jump into you, let me fuse the current question with the next one, which is how do you build the governance program and how do you measure the metrics of success? So Whitney, take it away, please.
Yeah, great. So at a high level, Jim has made a lot of really great points that I agree with. I will particularly say, I mean, given the role and the way that regulators like the FTC have talked about, or even the role of the data protection officer, right? Just from a regulatory perspective, has said this is a board level problem, right? Security and privacy are board level issues. I really believe that that top-down governance structure is really key because it can drive a centralized vision and have a seat at the right tables. And that's going to be really important to building that culture of privacy so that, there are KRs and other goals related to what needs to move forward from the organization, whether it be from a compliance perspective or generally from a business value perspective, whatever it is from a resourcing perspective, being able to have that discussion at the right levels is going to just like unlock opportunities in a way that like the more decentralized way, I just don't think is as effective. Again, there are probably exceptions to that. This is, again, just my personal opinion because I think organizations are built differently and operate differently. And so there are definitely probably structures that makes more sense for those organizations. As far as how do I think about measuring and the effectiveness of a privacy program, I think about, and this is a mushy metric, is how often do people ask for privacy to sit in the room? And do they want to invite you into the conversation because they see the value of including you early? And that means that you've effectively communicated what you can deliver for the business to bring that value to. They understand why bringing you in early will save them time, energy, and money, or why they understand the value of that compliance initiative that you may have. So I really look at like, are people coming to you early and saying, hey, like, I'd love your thoughts on this, even if it's organically, just to get those conversations rolling. To me, if you have that organic conversation happening at any sort of level in your organization where people see you as a true partner that they want to have in the room, you're really driving an effective privacy program because they don't see you as a hurdle that they have to jump over, but rather somebody who's, like to Jim's points before, providing that business value, and they see that, which means you've communicated the value of the privacy program to your organization.
Fantastic. And I'm going to start wrapping up. We typically have these for 45 minutes or so. So thank you both so much. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Whitney. I want to thank all the attendees. Vamsi will reach out to you for follow-ups in the link for the privacy engineering community. The goal behind today's forum was to prepare the new chief privacy officer, not just as a risk mitigator, but somebody as an organizational leader, a technologist and innovator. And these two individuals have done a great job in their careers in the community. So please, let's keep the conversation going. We look forward to seeing you in our next webinars. Any last thoughts, Whitney, Jim, as you say bye to the audience?
No, thank you all so much and keep at it. Yeah.
Jim?
Yeah, I think we are entering the golden age of privacy, so keep at it. It's only going to get better. I think this is going to be a remarkable journey.
On that upbeat note, thank you all so much. Have a good rest of the week and have a good weekend as well. Thank you so much. See you next time.